The carriage stopped at the foot of a drive she had never seen, and the footman who opened the door did not meet her eyes. Rain had been falling since reading, a thin gray rain that smelled of wet stone and cold chimneys, and it had soaked through the hem of her traveling gown so that it clung to her ankles like a hand that did not wish to let go. Honoria Vane, who had been the Duchess of Wexford for 11 months and 4 days, stepped down onto gravel that had not been raked in some time and looked up at the house her husband had sent her to. Graymere. The name had been written on the bottom of his note in a hand, so even it might have been copied from a ledger. The windows were dark. A single light moved in an upper room, then stilled. She understood, standing there with the rain running off the brim of her bonnet, that she had not been sent to a home. She had been sent to a place far enough away that no one in London would have to think of her again. She did not weep. She had done her weeping in the first week, quietly, into a pillow that smelled of lavender in another woman's house. And she had decided afterward that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend on a man who would never see them. So she gathered her skirts, and she climbed the steps, and she knocked at her own front door like a guest. If you have ever been made to feel that you were a problem someone wished to file away and forget, stay with this one. You will want to see how it ends. The man who opened the door was old, and his coat had been mended at the elbow with thread a shade too dark, and he stared at her, as though she were a ghost. Arrived to settle an old account. His name, she would learn, was Pelham. And he had kept Graymere alone for 6 years, since the last of the family who owned it before the Wexford line absorbed it had died without an heir who wanted the place. He took her wet mantle with hands that shook slightly, from age or from cold, and he said, "Your Grace, we had not been told to expect you." And Honoria, who had been told nothing herself until the morning the carriage came, answered that no one had been told much of anything. And would he be so kind as to find her a fire? To understand why a duke would send his wife of less than a year to a shuttered house in the middle of Somerset, you must understand how the marriage had come about. And to understand that you must go back to a morning the previous spring, when Honoria's father had died with debts that filled 4 pages and assets that filled half of one. Sir Edmund Vane had been a clever man, with money right up until the year he was not, and the year he was not had taken everything. The house in Bath went first, then the horses, then the small estate in Wiltshire that had been meant to be Honoria's portion. By the time he was buried, the creditors had begun to call at the door before the mourning cloth was down, and Honoria, who was 23 and had never in her life been taught to expect that she would have to manage such things, found that there was no one to manage them but her. Her mother had died when she was small. Her only brother had gone to sea, and not written in 2 years. She sat at her father's desk, with his spectacles still folded on the blotter, and learned in the space of a single afternoon exactly how much a gentlewoman with no fortune and no protector was worth in the open market of the world. The answer was not flattering. The offer, when it came through a solicitor. The Duke of Wexford, the solicitor explained, was in want of a wife. He required one of good birth, quiet habits, and no expectations. He was prepared to settle Sir Edmund's debts entirely, and to provide for his widow's daughter the security of his name. He did not require affection. He did not, the solicitor said carefully, require very much of anything except discretion. Honoria had asked whether she might meet the Duke before she answered. The solicitor had looked faintly surprised, as though the question were a small breach of manners, and had said that his Grace was much occupied, but that he was sure an introduction could be arranged before the ceremony. She met him 11 days before she married him. He was tall and dark, and perhaps 35, and he had the kind of face that seemed to have decided long ago that it would give nothing away and had kept the resolution faithfully ever since. Julian Ashcombe, the Duke of Wexford, had risen when she entered the room, and bowed precisely the correct depth, and asked after her health in a voice that suggested he was reading the words from somewhere just behind her left shoulder. She had answered. He had nodded. The whole interview had lasted under a quarter of an hour, and at the end of it he had said, "Miss Vane, I will not pretend this is anything other than what it is. I require a wife in name. You require security. I think we may deal honestly with one another if we do not expect more than that. and she, who had spent 11 days rehearsing 100 graceful things to say, had found that the only honest thing was to agree. They were married in a small church with 6 guests, and she had moved into his house in Grosvenor Square, and she had learned within a month that a wife in name was a very particular and very lonely thing to be. He was courteous. He was never unkind. He was also almost never there. And when he was there, he treated her with the distant correctness of a man being polite to a stranger at a dinner he had not wished to attend. She presided over his table when he entertained, which was seldom. She managed his household, which was already managed perfectly well without her. She had a generous allowance and a fine wardrobe and a husband who would cross a room to avoid being trapped into conversation with her. And she had begun to understand that the security she had purchased had a price she had not seen written anywhere in the settlement. The thing that ended it, or seemed to end it, was so small that she could scarcely believe afterward that it had carried such weight. His aunt had been there, the Dowager Lady Stanmore, a woman of 70, with a back like a fire iron, and an opinion of Honoria she had not troubled to conceal from the first. Over the soup, Lady Stanmore had remarked to the table at large that it was a pity, was it not, that Julian had been obliged to take a wife from such reduced circumstances, when there had been girls of real family quite willing. "She is a sweet enough creature," the Dowager had said, looking at Honoria as though she were a length of cloth of indifferent quality. "But one cannot make a duchess out of a bankrupt's daughter. There is no carriage in her." Honoria had set down her spoon, and she had said, in a voice that did not shake, that she had always understood a duchess to be made by a duke, and that if his grace had wished for a carriage, he ought to have purchased a different one. The table had gone very still. Lady Stanmore had turned the color of cold mutton, and the duke, at the head of the table, had said nothing at all, only looked at his wife for a long moment with an expression she could not read, before turning the conversation to the weather. 3 days later the carriage came for Graymere. She did not believe, even then, that he had sent her away for a single sharp sentence at a dinner table. A man did not banish a wife for defending herself. Yet she had no other explanation, and he had given her none. Only the note in that even hand. "It is best you remove to the country for a time. Graymere is at your disposal. I have given instruction that your wants will be supplied." He had not signed it with anything but his initial. She had read it 4 times, looking for the word that would tell her what she had done, and there had been no such word, because she had not done anything at all except exist in a way that had become inconvenient to the Dowager, to the household, to the whole apparatus of his life. She had become a problem to be solved, and Graymere was the solving of it. So, here she was in a cold house with 1 old servant, and a fire that smoked, and a husband 200 miles away who had filed her under country and shut the drawer. The first week she spent simply learning the house. It was larger than she had thought from the drive, and older, with a wing that had been closed off entirely, and rooms whose furniture stood under sheets, like a congregation of patient ghosts. Pelham followed her from room to room with a branch of candles, naming what things he remembered and apologizing for the dust. There was a library, long and high and lined to the ceiling with books no one had opened in a decade, and a great hall with a stone floor and a fireplace a man could stand upright in, and a schoolroom in the old nursery wing, with a slate still chalked with a child's sums from some forgotten lesson. Honoria stood in that schoolroom a long time. The sums were simple: addition and a little subtraction, and someone had drawn a horse in the margin with great care and not much skill, and she found herself moved almost to tears by a child she would never know who had sat at that small desk, and done his figures, and dreamed between them of a horse. She asked Pelham, who lived nearby. He told her the village was called Nethercombe, a mile down the valley, and that it was a poor place, mostly. The land had been hard since the bad harvests, and the wool trade that had once kept the cottages had moved north to the mills, and there was a deal of want in the village that the parish did what little it could to ease. The children, he said, ran wild. For the most part, there was no school. The nearest was at Wells, too far for a labourer's child to walk, and the dame who had once taught letters in the village had died the winter before last, and no one had taken her place. Honoria asked how many children there were. Pelham considered. 40, he said. Perhaps more. He had not counted. She walked down to Nether Combe the next morning, in stout shoes and her plainest gown, and she saw that Pelham had told her the truth, and softened it. The cottages leaned. The children were thin and barefoot in the mud despite the cold, and they watched her pass with the flat, wary eyes of small creatures who had learned that strangers brought trouble more often than not. She stopped at the well where 2 women were drawing water, and she introduced herself simply as the lady up at Greymere, and she asked about the children and whether they had any letters. The younger woman laughed, not unkindly, and said that letters did not fill a belly, my lady, and that her boy had work enough scaring birds from what little the gardens grew. The older woman said nothing, but she looked at Honoria with a sharp, assessing patience, and after a moment she said, "You are asking a great many questions for a lady passing through." Honoria said that she was not passing through. She had come to stay. That night she sat in the cold library with a single candle and a sheet of the Duke's good paper, and she did not write to her husband. She wrote a list. At the top she wrote the word school, and she underlined it once, and then she sat looking at it for a long while, as the rain came on again against the dark glass, and somewhere in the house, Pelham's slow tread went up the stairs to bed. She had purchased security with her name, and found it was a cage. A cage, she thought, was only a room with the wrong use put to it, and Greymere was full of rooms. She began with the great hall, because it was the largest and the easiest to warm, and because the long table that had once seated the family of the house could seat a great many children if she took out the leaves and pushed it to the wall. Pelham was doubtful. He pointed out gently that his Grace had given instruction her wants would be supplied, and that he did not think a parish school had been among the wants his Grace had in mind. Honoria agreed that it very likely had not. The instruction, she observed, had not specified which wants, and she found that she wanted a school more than she had ever wanted anything that money could simply buy. Pelham looked at her for a moment with something in his old face that had not been there before. A kind of slow, waking interest, and then he said that there was a quantity of slate in the old dairy, and benches in the closed wing that wanted only mending, and that his hands were not so stiff yet that he could not hold a hammer. It took a month to ready the room, and another fortnight to fill it. The mothers came first, suspicious, to see what the lady up at Greymere truly meant, and Honoria met each one at the door and did not condescend to a single one of them, and slowly the suspicion thinned. She made it known there would be a meal. That, more than letters, brought the children. A laborer's wife could not spare a child from work for the sake of the alphabet. But a child who was fed at the great house at midday was a child whose share of the family's bread was saved, and so they came. First a handful, then a dozen, then 30, then more than Pelham had counted. Honoria taught them herself, every morning, 6 days in the week. She had no training as a teacher, and no books fit for children. So she taught them from what she had. She taught them their letters from the spines in the library. She taught them sums with dried beans and a slate. She read to them in the afternoons from whatever she could find, and discovered that a room full of hungry children would sit utterly still for a story, and that the stillness of children who are being given something they have never had is one of the most humbling silences in the world. What she did not know, through all of that first long winter, was that she was being watched. Not by her husband. He had not written. Greymere, though, did not exist in a vacuum, and a duchess running a parish school out of a great hall is not a thing that stays quiet in a county. Word of it traveled, the way such things do, from the village to the market town to the dinner tables of the gentry who had country seats within a day's ride, and from there, eventually, by the slow circuitous routes that gossip takes, back toward London. The first Honoria heard of any of it was a letter, not from the Duke, but from the wife of the local squire, a Mrs. Audley, inviting her to dine. She had thought herself entirely forgotten by her own kind. She had not understood that she was becoming in the small world of the county a person of considerable interest. she would have been content to be forgotten by London forever. London, however, had not finished with her, and the form its attention took, when it came, was the Dowager. Lady Stanmore arrived at Graymere on a grey afternoon in March, in a travelling carriage with the Wexford Arms on the door, unannounced, and she was shown into the great hall because there was nowhere else warm, and because Honoria was in the middle of a lesson and did not see why she should stop it. The Dowager stood in the doorway in her furs and surveyed the room. 40 children at trestle benches. Slates. The smell of the soup that was Pelham's department now kept hot in a great pot by the fire. A duchess in a plain grey gown with chalk on her cuff, kneeling beside a small girl to help her form the letter B. Lady Stanmore took it in, and her face arranged itself into an expression of deep distaste, and she said, into the sudden quiet, "So it is true. You have turned a ducal house into a charity ward." Honoria rose. She sent the children to their soup with a word, and she crossed the room. And she said that the Dowager was welcome to warm herself, and that they might speak in the library, where they would not interrupt the meal. In the library, Lady Stanmore did not sit. She turned on Honoria with the cold fury of a woman whose entire understanding of the order of things had been affronted, and she said that the girl had brought disgrace on the name, that it was being spoken of in 3 counties, that the Duchess of Wexford kept a school for peasants in her own dining hall, that it was vulgar, that it was an embarrassment. That Julian would be made a laughing-stock when it reached town, as it surely would a bankrupt's daughter, she said. And the old contempt was bearing it now, playing at almsgiving, to make herself feel grand. I knew what you were the day he brought you. I told him. A girl with no carriage in her, no notion of what the name requires, and now you shame us all. Honoria listened to the whole of it. And when the Dowager had finished, she said quietly that she was sorry the Dowager found the sight of fed children distasteful, and that she would not be closing the school. Lady Stanmore stared at her. "You forget yourself," she said. "You forget who pays for the bread you are so liberal with." Honoria said that she had forgotten nothing, that the bread was bought with the Duke's money, which was true, and that she would render an account of every loaf of it to him directly, if he wished to ask, but that he had not asked, because he had sent her here precisely so that he would never again have to think of her at all, and that she would not waste the only freedom that exile had given her in order to spare the Dowager the discomfort of a thing she did not understand. It was the longest speech she had made since her wedding day, and her hands were trembling when it was done, and the Dowager's face had gone very still. That night alone, Honoria understood that she had crossed a line she could not step back over, and that the Dowager would not let it rest, and that whatever fragile distance her husband had filed her away into would now be disturbed. She had not meant to fight, she had meant only to be useful. Yet she found, examining her own heart in the candlelight, that she did not regret a word, and that frightened her more than the Dowager's fury had. The letter from the Duke came 9 days later. It was longer than the first. It did not, however, contain a word of reproach. It said only that he had received certain reports concerning the use to which Graymere had been put, that he intended to come down himself to see the matter, and that she might expect him within the week. He signed it this time, with his full name. Honoria read it, standing at the library window with the rooks calling over the bare trees, and she found that her heart was beating in her throat in a way that had nothing to do with fear of being scolded, and she was angry at herself for it. She had built something here. She had built it out of nothing, out of cold rooms and old slate in her own 2 hands, and she would not let him take it from her without making him look at it first. He arrived on the 4th day, in the late afternoon when the lessons were done, and the children gone home down the valley, and the great hall held only the long light and the smell of the day's soup, and the rows of small slates stacked to dry. Honoria heard the carriage on the gravel and did not go down. She waited in the hall, by the fire, with chalk still on her cuff because she had not thought to change, and, when he came in, she saw that the journey had marked him, that he was thinner than she remembered, and there was grey at his temple that had not been there in the autumn, and that he stopped just inside the door and looked at the room exactly as the Dowager had looked at it, taking in the benches and the slates and the great pot by the fire, except that what crossed his face was not distaste. She could not have named what it was. He stood there a long moment in his traveling coat. Then he said, in the level voice she remembered, "You have been busy." And Honoria, who had prepared 100 defenses, found she needed none of them, and said only, "Yes." He walked the length of the hall slowly. He stopped at the wall where the children's work was pinned, the wavering rows of letters, the careful, clumsy sums, and a child's drawing of a horse that Honoria had found in the old schoolroom, and given pride of place. He looked at the horse a long time. When he turned back to her, his face had changed in a way she had never seen it change, the careful blankness gone from it like ice gone off a window. And he said, "My brother drew this." Honoria did not understand. He said, "Edward. He was a boy here before the house came to us. He drew horses on everything. He could not do his sums to save his life. And he drew horses in every margin and on every wall. And our father beat him for it." He said it flatly, the way a man says a thing he has carried so long it no longer has edges. And Honoria stood very still because she understood, now that she had been wrong about a great many things. What he told her then, standing in the cold hall with the light failing, he had told no one. That Graymere had been his mother's family's house and his younger brother Edward's favorite place in the world, and that Edward had died at 19 of a fever. The winter the family quarrel sent him down here alone in disgrace, for a marriage their father forbade. That Julian, who had been abroad with his regiment, had not come, had been told it was a trifling illness, and had stayed away another 6 weeks and come home to a grave. That he had shut the house and never entered it again, and had inherited it along with everything else when the title fell to him, and had kept it shuttered for 6 years because he could not bear to set foot in the room where his brother had done his sums and drawn his horses and died alone, believing his family had cast him off. He had sent Honoria here, he said, his voice low, because she was the one person in his life he had not been able to keep at a distance, and the distance was the only way he knew how to survive. And Graymere was the farthest place there was. "I did not send you away because you displeased me," he said. "I sent you away because you did not, and I have regretted it from the hour the carriage left." Honoria had imagined this man for 11 months, as a wall. She saw now that he was a house with the rooms shut, exactly as Graymere had been, and that grief and not coldness had drawn the sheets over everything, and that he had done to himself what he had done to the house, which was to lock the door on the room where it hurt and call the silence peace. She crossed the hall to him. She did not touch him. She stood close enough that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, and she said that she had not turned his brother's house into a charity ward. She had turned it into the thing. A boy who drew horses in his margins might have wanted it to be. A place where children were taught and fed, and not beaten for dreaming. He looked at her, and something in his composure came apart, very quietly, the way the first crack runs through ice with almost no sound at all, and he said her name, Honoria, just that. She realized he had never once said it before. He stayed. He had meant, she understood, to stay a night and return to London, in his life of careful distances, and instead he stayed, and the staying was not a decision he announced, but one she watched him make over the following days in 100 small surrenders. He came down to the hall in the mornings and sat at the back while she taught, saying nothing, and the children grew used to the tall, silent gentleman who watched. He walked the valley with her in the gray afternoons and let her show him the village, the leaning cottages, the well, and he listened. And she saw him beginning to calculate in the way that men of his kind calculate, not how to be rid of a problem, but how to mend one. He found Pelham mending a bench one evening and took the hammer from the old man's stiff hands without a word and finished the work himself. And Pelham let him, and afterward the two of them sat by the fire a long while and did not speak. And Honoria, watching from the doorway, understood that the Duke was visiting his brother in the only way that remained to him, which was to do the small mending work of the house his brother had loved. London, however, does not surrender its verdicts easily, and the Dowager had not been idle. She had gone back to town, and she had talked, and the talk had taken the shape she gave it, which was that the Duke's reduced little wife had run mad in the country and made a public spectacle of the family name, and that something must be done, and that the something was an annulment, or a quiet separation, and a more suitable arrangement thereafter. She had a candidate in mind for the thereafter, a Lady Carlisle's daughter, all the right family and a fortune besides, and she had begun the careful work of making it seem that this had always been the sensible course, and that Honoria's banishment had been the first wise step toward it. When Julian did not return to town on the expected day, and then did not return the day after that, the dowager grew alarmed, and she did what such women do when a plan begins to slip. She forced the matter into the open. She arranged a dinner, a large one, at the Wexford House in Grosvenor Square, ostensibly to welcome the Duke back to town for the season, and she let it be known that the Duchess would not be present, and she seated Lady Carlisle's daughter at the place a wife should have, and she invited everyone who mattered, so that the absence of the wife and the presence of the substitute would speak for themselves and make the arrangement a settled thing before anyone had said it aloud. She did not know that the Duke had read her perfectly. He had spent 6 years being the most distant man in London, precisely so that no one could read him, and he had learned in the school of his own grief exactly how the world's machinery worked and exactly how to let it run on while he did the opposite of what it expected. He told Honoria of the dinner the morning the news of it reached Graymere. He told her of the empty chair and the substitute placed in it, and the verdict the whole room was being arranged to deliver. And then he asked her formally, as he had never once asked her anything, whether she would do him the honor of returning to London on his arm, to the same table, before the same people. Honoria looked at the man who had sent her 200 miles into the dark 11 weeks before, and who now stood in his brother's hall asking, not commanding, and she understood that he was offering her the one thing he had never given anyone, which was the sight of him with the door open, and she said yes. They reached Grosvenor Square the evening of the dinner, late after the company had sat down, which was deliberate. Honoria had wished to dress plainly, and Julian had said no, not from vanity, but from strategy, and she had worn the deep green silk that had been part of the wardrobe she came to him with and never had occasion to use, and her grandmother's pearls. And she had walked up the steps of the house she had been exiled from on the arm of her husband while the footman stared. The dining-room doors were opened. The whole long table turned. There at its head sat the dowager in her diamonds, and at the Duke's place sat Lady Carlisle's daughter, a pretty girl with a frightened face who understood in an instant that she had been made an instrument of something she had not chosen, and all down the table the faces of London's first families registered, one after another. The impossible fact of the Duchess of Wexford, alive and well, and standing in the doorway in green silk, with the Duke's hand at the small of her back, the dowager rose. Her composure was magnificent, and it was also, Honoria saw, the composure of a woman who has felt the floor begin to move. She said with a smile like a drawn blade, "Julian, we had not looked for you to bring a guest." And the room held its breath, because the word guest was the verdict. The reduction, the filing away made audible, and every soul at that table knew it. Julian Ashcombe looked at his aunt down the length of his own table. He did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to. "This is not my guest," he said. "This is my wife, and the only duchess this house will have." The silence after it was complete. Honoria heard the fire shift in the grate. She heard, somewhere, a fork set down. The dowager's smile did not so much fall as dissolve, the certainty going out of her face by degrees. And Lady Carlisle's daughter rose from the Duke's place so quickly she nearly upset her chair, and moved away from it as though it had grown hot, and the small motion broke the spell across the whole room so that the company began. One, a rustle of silk and a scrape of chairs, to do what companies do when the wind has plainly changed, which is to remember all at once that they had always thought the Duchess a charming creature. Julian crossed the room. He did not gloat. He drew out the empty chair beside his own, the one that had been left empty as an insult, and he seated his wife in it with his own hands, and he took his place beside her, and he said to the table, in the same level voice, that the Duchess had been doing him the honor of restoring his late brother's house, and that he hoped those present would forgive his having kept her to himself so long. It was a sentence that rewrote everything. It turned the exile into a project, the scandal into a charity, the banished wife into a woman of such consequence that the Duke had selfishly hoarded her in the country. It was, Honoria understood, a lie told with perfect kindness, and it gave every person at that table a graceful way to have always been on the right side, and it left the Dowager nowhere to stand at all. Lady Stanmore did not finish the dinner. She withdrew before the second course, pleading the headache, and the headache became, over the following weeks, a removal to Bath for her health, and from Bath she did not soon return. She was not destroyed. She was not even publicly rebuked. She was simply, quietly, no longer the person whose opinion arranged the room, and for a woman whose whole life had been the arranging of rooms, that was a country more distant than any Somerset. None of that, though, was the part Honoria carried with her afterward. The part she carried was later that night, when the guests had gone, and the house in Grosvenor Square was quiet, and Julian had come to find her in the small sitting room where she had spent so many lonely evenings the year before. He had stood in the doorway, as though uncertain of his welcome in a room of his own house, and she had thought, with a tenderness that ached, that he was a man learning a language late and clumsy in it, and trying. He said that he wished to ask her something and that she must feel entirely free to refuse. He said that he had been a fool and a coward and that he did not deserve to ask it. And then he asked whether she would consent to be his wife, in fact, and not only in name, whether she might in time, if he proved himself, come to want him as he had come, against all his careful arrangements to want her. He did not reach for her. He stood across the room, with his hands at his sides, and his heart for the first time in his face. And Honoria, who had been warmed and frightened by the nearness of him for weeks without permitting herself to name it, felt her own composure go the way his had gone in the hall at Graymere. All at once and almost silently, and she crossed the room and she put her hand against his jaw where the carved stillness had been. And she felt the pulse leap under her palm, and she said that she had wanted him since before she had any right to, and that she would be glad to spend her life proving it to a man who had to be taught to believe he could be loved. He turned his face into her hand. He did not kiss her at once. He stood with her palm against his cheek and his eyes closed, a tall man undone by the simplest of touches, and the not yet of it was its own kind of vow, the held breath before a thing that cannot be unmade. And when at last he did kiss her, it was slow and full of a promise. Neither of them spoke. They went back to Graymere in the spring. They went together this time, in the same carriage, and Honoria watched her husband's face as the drive came into view and saw him brace at the last for the grief that lived in the house, and then saw the brace ease as the great hall doors opened and the sound came out to meet them, which was the sound of 40 children at their letters. A high, tuneless, industrious murmur that no shuttered house in mourning had ever made. Julian stood on the steps a long moment, listening to it. The school had gone on without her. She had left it in the care of a curate's daughter from Wells, and Pelham's stubborn devotion, and it had not faltered, and the sound of it filling his brother's house seemed to reach the Duke somewhere that nothing had reached in 6 years. They made it proper after that, and larger. There was money now turned to it openly, and a real schoolroom built in the old nursery wing where Edward had done his sums and a master engaged, and Honoria kept the morning lessons for herself because she could not bear to give them up. The drawing of the horse stayed on the wall, framed now, in the room where it had been made. Julian had it framed himself. He stood before it sometimes in the evenings, the way another man might stand before a grave, except that this was not a grave. It was a room full of the thing his brother had wanted and never been given, and Honoria would find him there and put her hand in his, and they would stand together and say nothing because some accounts are not settled with words. On the last evening of that first spring, she came down late and found the great hall empty and the fire burned low, and on the long table where the slates were stacked to dry for the morning, someone had drawn a horse in chalk in the corner of the topmost slate, a careful, clumsy, hopeful horse, drawn by a child who would come back in the morning to do his sums beside it. She did not wipe it away. She set the slate aside where it would not be cleaned, and she stood a while in the quiet with the fire ticking down. In the house she had been sent to be forgotten in, and had filled instead with children and letters and the long-shut light, and she thought that she had come here a problem to be filed away, and had stayed to become the thing that opened every locked room in it, including the one her husband had been keeping the longest. Then she banked the fire and she went up to him, and the house held its small sleeping warmth around them. And outside the late frost came down silver, on the valley and on Nethercombe, and on all the small cottages where, in the morning, the children would wake and come up the hill to school. If this one stayed with you, you might tell me which moment you would underline. And thank you, as always, for staying until the end.